The Helix 9 medical station orbited a forgettable moon in a forgettable system, which made it the perfect place for the galaxy's various species to patch themselves up without answering awkward questions. The facility prided itself on treating everyone, from the crystalline yandere who shattered at room temperature, to the gelatinous Pholox who needed to be kept in pressurized tanks. Standard stuff, really. Tuesdays were usually quiet. Then the emergency pod arrived and Tuesday became significantly less boring. Dr. Wine, a four-armed anthelian, with more medical degrees than most species had limbs, stood over the examination table with what could only be described as professionally offended confusion. His tertiary hands were checking readings for the 15th time while his primary hands hovered uselessly over the unconscious form before him. Behind him, Nurse Dalla, whose species the Helixians had evolved specifically to feel other beings' pain as empathic feedback, had already excused herself to go vomit in the hallway. Again, the patient was human, female, approximately 28 solar cycles old, give or take whatever weird time dilation humans experienced in their absurdly short lifespans. She was also, by every medical standard Wine had learned in his 2 centuries of practice, completely and utterly dead, except she wasn't. Her heart, that primitive single-chambered pump humans inexplicably relied upon, was still beating. Slowly, yes. Irregularly, absolutely, but beating nonetheless, which was frankly insulting to medical science. Run the scan again, Wine said to no one in particular. The station's AI had already run it 6 times. The results hadn't changed. They weren't going to change. Reality was apparently just this inconsiderate today. The wound patterns were what broke his brain. Wine had seen plasma burns be 3 parallel scores across her torso, each one deep enough that he could see where the energy had cauterized tissue that should have been vital organs. On a Helixian, that injury would have resulted in immediate systemic failure. On an Anthelian, all 4 of their cardiovascular nodes would have ruptured simultaneously. On literally any registered species, those burns would have triggered a cascade of biological failures that ended in very definite, very final death. Humans, apparently just found that mildly inconvenient. Then there was her left arm, compound fracture of both bones, displaced at an angle that suggested something very large had stepped on it, then dragged. The bones had begun knitting themselves back together. Wrong, certainly. The angle was going to require re-breaking and proper setting, but the fact that her body had looked at that devastation and thought, "I'll just start fixing this myself," was perhaps the most arrogant thing Wine had ever witnessed from a biological system. Her right leg told a similar story of biological audacity: torn musculature, severed connective tissue, and what appeared to be a puncture wound from a Vraxian combat blade, which meant whoever had stabbed her had been aiming to sever the major artery. They'd succeeded too. Wine could see where the vessel had been compromised. What he couldn't understand was how she still had enough blood pressure to maintain consciousness long enough to get into an escape pod. Actually, scratch that. He couldn't understand how she had enough blood, period. The pod's interior had been decorated in what the station's cleaning crew was diplomatically calling significant biological matter. The human had apparently bled enough to paint abstract art across 3 walls and still had enough left over to keep her brain functioning. Dalla returned, looking green, which was impressive given her species was naturally purple. "The neural scans are back," she said weakly. "There's brain activity." "Of course there is," Wine muttered, checking the readings. "Higher cognitive functions too." The human wasn't just alive, she was dreaming. Probably about something absurd like persistence hunting, or eating capsaicin for recreation, or whatever else humans did that made the rest of the galaxy question the universe's quality control standard. The medical database had very little information on humans. They were newcomers to the galactic stage, barely 3 decades into first contact. Most species treated them like adorable deathworlders, all fond of their high gravity and toxic atmosphere, and predator eye. Fragile things really, compared to the civilized species who'd evolved on sensible planets with reasonable conditions. The database listed their average lifespan at roughly 80 cycles, their bone density as adequate, and their pain tolerance as presumed moderate. Wine was going to have words with whoever wrote that entry. "What do we even do with her?" Dalla asked, maintaining a careful distance from the table. I mean, standard protocol says we should be preparing funeral rites, but she's just lying there being alive at us. We stabilize what we can, Wine said, which was easier said than done when he wasn't entirely sure what stable looked like for a species that apparently used catastrophic injury as a suggestion, rather than a diagnosis. And we figure out what happened to her. The escape pod's logs had been partially corrupted, but what remained painted an interesting picture. A transport ship. Vraxian pirates, because of course it was Vraxian pirates. Those particular reptilian thugs had made careers out of raiding the newer species vessels. A boarding action fighting in the corridors. Then static, and the automated distress beacon. Standard tragedy, really. Happened every few cycles. Most species who encountered Vraxian pirates during a raid had the good sense to die quickly. The Vraxians were thorough like that. Professional even. They didn't leave survivors because survivors meant witnesses, and witnesses meant the enforcers eventually got involved. This human had apparently not received that memo. Wine's secondary hands pulled up the tissue regeneration protocol. His primary hands reached for the surgical field generators. Behind him, Dalla steeled herself and returned to her station, though she kept one hand near the nausea suppressant dispenser. Alert the station commander, Wine said quietly. Tell them we have a situation, and someone find me everything we have on human physiology, because apparently the textbooks are lying. On the table, the human's heart continued its stubborn, irregular beating. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths that should have been impossible with her injury. And somewhere in her unconscious mind, behind those closed predator eyes, something that refused to acknowledge the very concept of defeat, kept her biological systems running on spite and whatever other mystery fuel humans apparently operated on. Wine looked at the wound patterns again, then at the readouts showing impossible vital signs, then back at the human. Fragile, he muttered with profound sarcasm. Right, absolutely delicate. Tuesday was definitely ruined now. The medical team's investigation into their patient's survival began with confidence and ended approximately 40 minutes later, with Wine staring at a holographic display like it had personally insulted his ancestors. This can't be right, he said for the 18th time, which was becoming something of a mantra. His tertiary hands were frantically cross-referencing the human's cellular scans with every known biological database in the galaxy. His primary hands were gripping the edge of the console hard enough to leave dents. Dalla had given up on subtlety and was openly drinking something that looked medicinal and probably wasn't. Her bone density is twice what the database says it should be. The calcium matrix is reinforced with trace minerals we don't even have classifications for. That's not the alarming part, Wine said, which was a sentence he never thought he'd utter. Look at her muscle tissue response to the plasma burn. The hologram zoomed in on the cellular level, showing something that made both of them go very quiet. Where the plasma had scorched through tissue, the surrounding cells hadn't just died and waited for medical intervention like civilized biology demanded. No, they'd gone into what the scanner was diplomatically labeling aggressive regenerative overdrive. The cells were rebuilding damaged tissue, rerouting blood flow, and apparently holding a committee meeting to decide which organs were technically optional during crisis situations. Her liver had been partially vaporized. The remaining portion had simply expanded its function to compensate. That wasn't medicine. That was biological improvisation bordering on evolutionary spite. Pull up the escape pod's interior logs again, Wine ordered. The ones from before she lost consciousness. The footage was grainy, corrupted by plasma interference, and what appeared to be significant amounts of the human's own blood coating the camera lens. But what they could see was educational in the worst possible way. The human had dragged herself into the pod. Not crawled, dragged, using one functional arm while her broken one hung at an angle that made Dalla make a small whimpering sound. Her leg, the one with the Vraxian blade wound, was leaving a trail that suggested she'd lost enough blood to qualify as a biohazard incident. The timestamp showed this was approximately 6 minutes after the initial attack. 6 minutes. Most species would have achieved shock-induced unconsciousness in 30 seconds. This human had apparently decided shock was for quitters. The really educational part came when she'd reached the pod's medical kit. Instead of using the automated trauma system like any reasonable being, she'd ripped it open with her teeth, because apparently her functional hand was busy holding her intestines inside her body where they belonged. She'd grabbed a coagulant injector, stabbed it directly into her leg wound without even flinching on camera, then used her broken arm, the one that shouldn't have been movable, to smear emergency sealant across the plasma burns on her torso. Then she'd programmed the pod's navigation system, activated the distress beacon, and passed out in that order. Priorities, apparently. She performed field trauma care on herself, Dalla said slowly, as if speaking the words might make them make sense. They did, with injuries that should have shut down her nervous system entirely. Wine pulled up the biological stress markers from her blood work. The adrenaline levels were astronomical, cortisol through the ceiling, and something else, some chemical compound the database identified as endorphins, which apparently humans just manufactured internally when their bodies decided pain was becoming counterproductive to survival. They made their own medicine, while dying. That was just standard equipment. What about the attackers? Dalla asked. Did she just run? Or? Wayne pulled up another section of corrupted footage, this one from the transport ship's corridor cameras. The timestamp put it immediately before the escape pod footage. What they saw made them both go very still. The human was backing down a corridor, plasma pistol in one hand, firing with the kind of accuracy that suggested she'd done this before. 3 Vraxian pirates were advancing on her, which was their first mistake. Vraxians were 2 meters of scaled muscle and predatory instinct, bred for combat on a high-gravity world that made Earth look like a vacation resort. The human shot the first one in the throat, the second one in the center mass twice. The third one had closed the distance, which was when she'd gotten the plasma burns across her torso and the broken arm from being thrown into a bulkhead. That should have ended it right there. Instead, the human had grabbed a maintenance tool from a wall panel, something designed for prying open stuck hatches, and introduced the Vraxian's skull to the concept of blunt force trauma, with what the impact sensors registered as excessive enthusiasm. The Vraxian had gone down. She'd taken his combat blade, presumably the one that later ended up in her leg, and disappeared into the next corridor. The footage cut out after that, but the biological matter trail suggested the encounter hadn't ended well for anyone involved. She fought them, Wayne said quietly. With injuries that should have killed her 3 times over, she fought them, got to an escape pod, treated her own wounds, and lived long enough for us to find her. What kind of species does that? Dalla whispered. Wayne looked at the unconscious human on the table, still stubbornly breathing despite everything. The kind we've been dramatically underestimating, he said. Alert Sonobiology. Tell them we need to completely revise human durability classification. And someone get me the station commander, because if this is what happens when one human gets attacked by pirates, I have concerns about what happens when they decide to get organized about it. On the table, the human's vital signs continued their impossible stability. Her broken bones continued knitting themselves together wrong. And somewhere in the station's database, the entry for human pain tolerance quietly changed from presumed moderate to requires significant reevaluation. The galaxy, it seemed, had some learning to do. The human opened her eyes at hour 17 of observation, which was approximately 16 hours and 45 minutes earlier than Wayne's most optimistic projection. He was in the middle of explaining to the station commander why they needed to quarantine the entire medical bay, not because of contamination, but because he genuinely wasn't sure what the human might do when conscious, when Dalla's empathic sensors started screaming. She's awake, Dalla announced, which was when every piece of monitoring equipment in the bay decided to have an electronic panic attack simultaneously. Wayne turned to find the human sitting upright on the examination table, which was physically impossible, given that he'd specifically set the restraint field to prevent exactly that. She'd apparently informed the restraint field of its failure, and moved anyway. Her predator eyes swept the room with the kind of focus that suggested she was cataloging exits, threats, and improvised weapons in descending order of usefulness. Please remain calm, Wayne said in Galactic Common, keeping all 4 hands visible and non-threatening. You're in a medical facility. You're safe. The human looked down at herself, taking in the medical scaffolding supporting her broken arm, the regeneration field wrapped around her leg, and the tissue restoration patches covering the plasma burns across her torso. Her expression suggested she was personally offended by the existence of her injuries, How bad? She asked. Her voice was rough, probably from the breathing tube they'd had to use for the first 6 hours. How bad? Wayne repeated, wondering if the translation matrix was malfunctioning. You suffered 3 Class A plasma burns that penetrated to your internal organs, a compound fracture requiring surgical reconstruction, a combat blade wound that severed your primary leg artery, and enough blood loss to qualify as a mass casualty event. You should be dead, approximately 40 times over by every medical standard known to galactic science. The human processed this information for approximately 3 seconds. But I'm not. So like, how bad actually? Dalla made a sound like a deflating balloon. Wayne felt his secondary brain considering a stress-induced shutdown, which would have been embarrassing but understandable. 6 weeks of regeneration therapy, Wayne said slowly. Minimum. Probably 8, given the complexity of your injury. You'll need to remain in the medical bay under constant supervision while we— Can I walk? The human interrupted. Absolutely not. Your leg requires another 72 hours of cellular regeneration before we can even consider. The human swung her legs off the table. The monitoring equipment exploded into fresh alarms. Wayne's tertiary hands reached for the emergency sedation controls while his primary hands grabbed the nearest crash cart, because he was absolutely certain he was about to watch someone die from sheer stubbornness. The human stood up. Her injured leg trembled, held for a moment, then stabilized. She looked down at it with the kind of critical assessment usually reserved for malfunctioning equipment. Bit wobbly, she observed. I've had worse. You've had worse? Dalla shrieked, her empathic feedback apparently deciding this was an excellent time to share the human's pain sensations. She immediately regretted this evolutionary advantage, and collapsed into a chair, whimpering. The Vraxian pirates, Wayne said, desperately trying to maintain some professional composure. The ones who attacked your transport, we found evidence of the encounter. Can you tell us what happened? The human's expression went flat in a way that made Wayne's survival instincts, honed over 2 centuries of living, start screaming. They boarded the transport, killed most of the crew in the first few minutes. Standard raid, looking for cargo and hostages to ransom. She paused, testing weight on her injured leg. I disagreed with their business model. You fought 4 Vraxian pirates, Wayne said, with no combat armor, no weapons beyond what you found on the ship. 3 pirates, the human corrected. The 4th one was smart. He ran when his buddies stopped moving. She rotated her broken arm experimentally, wincing as the scaffolding prevented full movement. You're gonna need to take this off. It's restricting mobility. It's restricting mobility because your bones are broken, Wayne said, his professional calm finally cracking. They're broken in 7 places. The scaffolding is the only thing preventing the fragments from shredding what's left of your muscle tissue. You need weeks of regeneration before. Yeah, no, I get that, the human said, poking at the tissue restoration patches on her torso. But I can work around it. These plasma burns, they go deep to your organs. Dalla whispered from her chair. We watched you hold your intestines inside your body, on camera, while conscious. The human shrugged with her functional shoulder. Adrenaline's wild. Right? You just kind of push through. Mind over matter. Did my distress beacon reach anyone else? Or did you guys find me first? Wayne stared at her. You're asking about other survivors. You're barely a survivor. You're a medical impossibility held together with spite and whatever horrifying chemicals your body produces when it decides death is optional. So that's a no on other survivors, the human said, her expression darkening. The transport crew, the passengers. Anyone else make it to an escape pod? No, Wayne said quietly. The Vraxians were thorough. We found the wreckage. You were the only beacon. Something changed in the human's face. Not grief, exactly. Something colder, more calculating. She tested her leg again, taking a few careful steps. The monitoring equipment screamed at her. She ignored it with practiced ease. I need my things, she said. Whatever was in my pod. My communicator, my identification, and if they salvaged it, my pistol. You need 6 weeks of bed rest, Wayne countered. I need to file a report with the Enforcement Guild, the human said. Those pirates are still out there. They've got a ship, a crew, and a route they clearly use for regular raids. Someone needs to track them down before they hit another transport. Someone who isn't held together with medical scaffolding and regeneration fields. Dalamanit. The human looked at her, then at Wayne, then down at her own battered body. For a moment, Wayne thought perhaps reason might prevail. Perhaps this human might acknowledge her limitations and accept proper medical care like a civilized being. Then she smiled, and Wayne realized he'd been desperately wrong about which species in this room was civilized. "I've got at least 3 good limbs," the human said. "That's 2 more than I need." Wayne reached for the sedation controls. The human noticed and raised one finger in warning. "You can try," she said pleasantly. "But I should mention I metabolize most standard sedatives in about 4 minutes. It's a liver thing. We process toxins aggressively." "Of course you do," Wayne muttered. "Why wouldn't you?" Outside the medical bay, alarms were still ringing. The station commander was demanding updates. The xenobiology department was flooding his terminal with requests for tissue samples and cognitive assessment. And standing in front of him, a human who should have been dead was preparing to discharge herself against medical advice. Because apparently, near-death experiences were just minor inconveniences in her species' daily schedule. The galaxy's understanding of human fragility, Wayne reflected, required some significant revision, starting immediately. The station commander, a Felixian named Renth, whose species had evolved on a planet where the most dangerous predator was an aggressive freak, sat in his office, reviewing the incident report with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering the laws of physics, had taken a personal day off. His fur, normally a calm blue, had shifted to a stressed purple that clashed terribly with his uniform. "Let me understand this correctly," he said, reading the medical assessment for the 5th time. The human walked out of Medical Bay 17, past 4 security checkpoints, with injuries that your chief medical officer describes as, and I'm quoting here, incompatible with consciousness, let alone ambulation. Wayne, who'd been summoned to explain how exactly he'd lost a patient who could barely stand, nodded miserably. "She thanked us for our service and left. When I pointed out she was still attached to monitoring equipment, she disconnected it herself. When I threatened to call security, she reminded me that she'd signed the medical waiver and was legally allowed to refuse treatment. She had a punctured artery 12 hours ago," Renth said slowly. "We sealed it, mostly. There's still some minor leakage, but her coagulation system apparently decided that was tomorrow's problem and just routed circulation around it." Wayne's tertiary hands were fidgeting with his medical pad. "I've updated her file, and the human species classification, and possibly my personal belief system, regarding biological possibility." Renth pulled up the Galactic medical database, specifically the entry for humans. The changes were extensive. Where it had previously listed moderate durability and standard pain tolerance, it now read something considerably more alarming. Species, human origin, Earth-Dur, durability classification, extreme pain tolerance, dangerous ret, degenerative capacity, enhanced threat assessment, when injured, elevated medical notes, standard restraint fields inadequate, chemical sedation limited effectiveness, patient compliance unreliable, recommend multiple backup containment protocols if treatment is involuntary. Species demonstrates concerning tendency to categorize life-threatening injuries as minor inconveniences or not that bad actually. Medical staff should prepare for psychological stress when treating human patients who remain conscious. Advisory. Humans have been observed performing complex tasks, including navigation, combat and medical self-care while experiencing injuries that would incapacitate or kill most registered species. This appears to be normal behavior. Update your threat assessments accordingly. "Is this really necessary?" Renth asked, gesturing at the threat assessment section. "Commander," she asked if we had a spare shirt because hers had blood on it. Wayne said flatly. "Not medical clothing." "A shirt, so she could go file her report looking presentable. That's what she was concerned about. Presentation. While her bones were visibly misaligned under her skin, Renth's fur shifted to a darker purple. He'd been receiving reports all morning. The Enforcement Guild had taken the human statement, which apparently included detailed tactical information about Raxian raiding patterns, ship configurations, and recommended engagement strategy. She'd provided this information while standing, for 2 hours, occasionally pausing to adjust her medical scaffolding when it beeped warnings about structural integrity. The guild had been impressed, concerned, certainly, possibly horrified, but impressed. Then there were the other reports filtering in through the Galactic communication networks. Rent pulled them up, watching his office holo display fill with similar incident reports from across known space. The human merchant who'd survived decompression exposure for 47 seconds, long enough to manually seal the hull breach. A human engineer who'd walked 3 kilometers through a toxic atmosphere to reach an emergency shelter, arriving with melted boots and ruined lungs that somehow repaired themselves over the following week. A human security officer who'd continued fighting off station invaders despite losing enough blood to paint an entire corridor. Because apparently, humans could just decide their blood pressure was optional during emergencies. The pattern was becoming clear. Humans weren't fragile. They were durable in ways that made the rest of the galaxy's military species look like they'd been constructed from decorative glass and wishful thinking. "How many humans are there in galactic space now?" Rent asked quietly. "Current immigration records show approximately 47,000, his assistant replied. "Mostly working merchant vessels, station support, exploration crews. They integrate well, pleasant species generally." "Very social." "Pleasant," Rent repeated, thinking about the human who'd killed 3 Vraxian pirates with a maintenance tool and sheer vindictive determination. "Right. Pleasant." His terminal chimed with an incoming message. It was from the human, sent from whatever transport she'd managed to book passage on despite being held together with medical equipment and optimism. The message was brief. "Thanks for the patch job. Feeling much better already. If you see Wayne, tell him I'll come back in a few weeks for a proper checkup." Probably. As if a proper medical follow-up was a tentative plan rather than an absolute necessity. Rent forwarded the message to every station commander in the sector, along with the updated human classification file. Then he drafted a memo to the Galactic Council, politely suggesting they reconsider humanity's developing species status, and perhaps start thinking about them as something considerably more significant. After all, any species that could survive injuries like that and then politely thank you for the medical assistance before walking off to file paperwork was either going to be the galaxy's greatest ally or its most terrifying problem. Possibly both, depending on the day. 3 weeks later, the medical station received another emergency pod. This one contained a Vraxian pirate, barely alive, babbling about a human who'd tracked down their raiding ship and introduced their crew to what she'd called proportional respect. His wounds suggested she'd been creative about it, and thorough. Wayne treated him, updated the incident report, and added another note to the human medical database. "Species holds grudges. Plan accordingly." The galaxy was learning. Slowly, painfully, but learning nonetheless. And somewhere out in the black, a human with a healing leg and a broken arm, held together with medical scaffolding, was probably doing something that would require another database update. Because that apparently was just what humans did. They survived. They adapted. They kept going. And they absolutely refused to acknowledge that fatal meant anything more than mildly challenging. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, had decided to populate itself with species who understood their limitations and respected the fundamental rules of biology. Then it had made humans, looked at what it created, and apparently decided chaos was underrated. Wayne pulled up the human's medical file one last time, staring at the impossible readings and the even more impossible outcome. Fragile. The old database had called them delicate death-worlders, who needed protection from the harsh realities of galactic space. He added one final note to the file. Previous classification withdrawn. Humans are not fragile. Recommend treating as extremely durable species with enhanced pain tolerance and concerning disregard for personal safety. Medical staff should prepare accordingly, possibly with therapy. He submitted the update and watched it propagate through the galactic network, wondering how many other species were about to have their understanding of human limitations completely destroyed. Based on the incident reports still flooding in, he suspected the answer was all of them. The galaxy had spent decades treating humans like they were made of spun sugar and good intentions. Turned out, they were made of something considerably more resilient. Something that looked at mortal injuries and decided they were negotiable. Something that survived, because surrender apparently wasn't installed as standard equipment in their psychological operating system. Rent's terminal chimed again. Another incident report. Another human doing something that should have been impossible. Another database update. Required. He sighed, his fur shifting to resigned gray, and got to work. The galaxy was going to need a lot more database storage at this rate.